Hi, I'm back again with my free course on the history of Western art, and this is one of over 250 talks that I've arranged chronologically. I start with cave art through to art produced in the last few years. And this is section 23 on Victorian art. This talk is an overview of the art produced in the 19th century, sometimes called the long Victorian period, because of course Queen Victoria's reign was 1837 to 1901, but I'm dealing essentially with the whole 19th century. And the talk today is based on paintings in Tate Britain, as they have an excellent collection of British 19th century paintings, and this talk could be used as the basis of a personal tour of the gallery. Check, by the way, before visiting, as sometimes some of the paintings I'm going to be showing you won't be on display. For example, at the moment, a number of Turner's and Constable paintings have been removed from the permanent display to be set up in the exhibition that's taking place in a few months. So what I'd like to do is start with this little known painting by Joseph Mallord William Turner. It's called Ploughing Up Turnips near Slough. And I've selected it as it's a bit of an enigma. And I believe that it tells us a lot about one of the most important artists of the Victorian period. Now, for 170 years, historians and art critics regarded it as a pastoral landscape, an early morning view of Windsor Castle that you can make out in the background. So at first glance, it's uncontroversial. It was praised at the time for its poetically heightened atmospheric effects. And you can see the early sun reflecting off the morning mist in the middle ground. But in 1983, an art historian, John Barrell, pointed out that this was a painting produced during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon had blockaded the European ports to prevent food being taken to Britain. So in this light, we see the Royal Palace of Windsor in the background, representing monarchy. On the right, those towers you can see are part of Eton School, representing the aristocracy and education. And in the foreground, the labourers are working to produce the food needed by everyone during the war. This was the beginning of the agricultural revolution, and it went hand in hand with the industrial revolution, and English agriculture was amongst the most advanced in the world. However, more recently, another art historian in 2004 looked at the painting more closely and found a number of puzzling elements. The central part of the picture shows three men standing by a broken plough. So if this represents agricultural productivity at a time of war, why does Turner show us a broken plough? Second, look at the wheelbarrow on the right. It's full of turnips. Why turnips? Turnips had become a key crop supporting four-crop rotation, and that dramatically increased the productivity of the land, because it meant you didn't have to let some fields lie fallow for a year. Although turnips were therefore a sort of scientific wonder crop, they had other associations. The king, George III, was known as Farmer George, and he was associated with turnips. He was thought to be hoeing turnips when his father was, or grandfather, was called to become a king of England. He was known for his miserliness, George III, and turnips were a food that people wouldn't eat unless they were starving, or at least very hungry. It was regarded as a winter food for sheep and cattle. Also, turnips didn't grow very well in boggy soil, which is what we see here. We know the soil is boggy because we can see the mist arising in the middle ground, and we also see the plough needs 4 horses to pull it, and it's broken down. In the centre, there's a lit area, patch of weeds and a bottle. And at this time, drunkenness was a major problem on the farm as it reduced productivity. The other interesting element of this picture is the title. Remember, I called it Ploughing Up Turnips Near Slough. Now, today, Slough is a well-known commuter town. But in 1809, if you look on old maps, it's not even a town. It was a tiny hamlet of a few cottages. Not only that, no one referred to this view, which was a very well-known view, as Slough. Everyone knew it as Salt Hill, with its view of Windsor Castle. I mean, it was so well known that a few years later, the Prince Regent hosted a breakfast in the inn on Salt Hill for the King of Prussia and his 3 sons. And in his other paintings and sketches, Turner calls it a view of Windsor or Salt Hill. So why Slough? Perhaps because in the most popular book at the time, John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, the Slough of Despond is a boggy place made from the filth of sin that they had attempted to farm for, I think it was 1300 years without success. So if we consider the broken plough, the weeds, the bottle, the Slough of Despond, we get a different reading. Rather than patriotic, it suggests the terrible conditions and the plight of the rural worker. It's about rural discontent with this reading. So what is the correct reading? Well, my view is that Turner's genius has combined all 3 readings. He was well aware of all 3 readings. It is an idyllic scene of early morning sun. It is a celebration of agricultural productivity, and it is showing the problems of the rural poor. Bear this in mind, these deep meanings, the next time you look at a Turner. The other romantic artist at the time was John Constable. This is Flatford Mill seen on a navigable river, 1816 to 17. And along with Turner, Constable raised the profile of landscape painting at a time when, if you look at the exhibitions, the art establishment preferred portraiture and historical subjects. Constable was one of the pioneers of what's called en plein air, that is, painting out of doors. And it was around 1802 that he convinced himself that he should paint in oils outdoors because, amongst other reasons, he thought that Claude Lorraine had done so, even though Claude actually used only water-based media or drawing tools in his outdoor work. Now, Constable wasn't Turner. He's not illustrating the social conditions of the countryside, although you can read that into it. He's evoking childhood memories. He had enjoyed an idyllic boyhood that he wanted to capture. He wrote that for him, painting is but another word for feeling. And these childhood scenes, this was painted near the mill in which he was born, in his words, made me a painter, and I am grateful. The sound of water escaping from mill dams, etc., willows, old rotten planks, slimy posts and brickwork. I love such things. He also wrote, when I sit down to make a sketch from nature, the first thing I do is try to forget that I have ever seen a picture. What he meant by that is he, unlike other landscape painters, he wasn't copying the work of the old masters with their prescribed composition, brown foliage and grass. He was looking at the world afresh and painting what he saw. It wasn't always commercially successful, though. And although he did eventually become a Royal Academician, he only sold 20 paintings in England in his lifetime. Critics found his colours too bright. They objected to spotty foregrounds painted all over with whitewash and the snow in his trees, as they called it. However, he won a gold medal in Paris for the Haywain in 1824 and had a profound influence on the French Romantic painters, and he sold a further 20 paintings in France in just a few years. However, he never exploited that interest. He never visited France. He never, in fact, left Britain. Let's return briefly to Turner. This is a different sort of painting. This is a history painting, but recent history. It's the Field of Waterloo. And it's the first time we see a British artist painting an anti-war painting. Goya, of course, did the same a few years before. Turner here is emphasising war's tragic consequences for the victims on both sides. Before this, artists would paint heroic scenes inspired by nationalistic fervour. But here, Turner is painting the consequences. In the catalogue to the exhibition, he included this quote from the then controversial anti-war poem by Byron called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The quote was, "Rider and horse, friend, foe, in one red burial blent." Now, while Wordsworth, Robert Southey, Walter Scott are all producers of celebratory poems in the wake of Waterloo, Byron conceived of his verses as a way of reminding the public of the terrible toll of victory. 50,000 died. Some say 50 to 70,000. Byron was making a point in his poem. And although Byron thought Napoleon should have won, Turner is not so simplistic. He raises the question for us to come up with the answer. Sometimes, of course, asking a question is more powerful than pushing an answer. If you want to find out more about Turner and Constable, listen to my talks on the individual artists. But one further point about this painting, you see in the foreground, there's women, some holding babies, searching through the dead bodies. And this can be interpreted as wives looking for their husbands. However, what it could also be is looting. Looting was a major problem, even just a few hours after the battle. Bodies were stripped, everything was stolen to sell as souvenirs, even the teeth of the dead. For years afterwards, false teeth were known as Waterloo teeth, and they were worn with pride. This is a change of mood. It's Punch or Mayday by Benjamin Haydon. It's set in Marylebone in 1829, which is the end of the Regency period. You can see a mixture of the wealthy and the poor. It's set in New Road, and it's a little past noon, as we can see from the clock of the church. On the left, there's a Punch and Judy show, and we can see Punch beating his wife, which was a common feature of every Punch and Judy show. The show has drawn the crowds. They've blocked the road, resulting in a marriage coach, that's the coach on the right, nearly colliding with the hearse. That we can see that behind on the left. Sitting on the curb is a poor fruit seller who's arranged her meagre fare on a small table. And then to her right, there's a wealthy farmer who's so engrossed in the Punch and Judy show, he doesn't notice his pocket is being picked by a small boy. And notice how the well-dressed woman behind the boy is shielding him with her shawl and distracting the sailor with her coy smile. In front of them, a child chimney sweep, is posing like an actor on a stage with his broomstick slung over his shoulder. On the right, 3 figures are shown Morris May dancing. One dressed as a tree, and if you look very carefully towards the top of the tree, not right at the top, about a third of the way down or quarter of the way down, you can just make out an eye. There's a man inside dressed as a tree, known as the Green Man or Jack in the Green, a popular participant in May Day festivals. There's a woman in a red dress swinging a spoon or ladle. And then, interestingly, there's a boy with a blacked face. And we don't know the origin. We don't know why this Morris dancing typically had a boy with his face blacked up. There are various theories put forward, and I'll just run through some of them. One idea is it's based on the name. Why is it called Morris dancing? Some think that the word Morris derives from Moorish dancing, the Moors of Morocco, and it's mentioned in the late 15th century at the Tudor court. And this was a time when soldiers were celebrating their victory over the Moors in Spain. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that farm workers, we know, did blacken their face in the 14th century onwards so they could beg food in the winter without being recognised. You might think this is far-fetched, but in the 18th century, England actually passed a law, the Waltham Black Act, which made appearing in disguise, either by mask or by blackened face, a capital offence. Another possibility is the black face might symbolise coal dust, and therefore the boy goes down the mines for a living, or soot that covered the face of chimney sweeps, linking to the chimney sweep to the left of the May dancer. Another popular explanation is that it's a 19th century invention. It's based on copying the minstrel shows where white performers used blackface to caricature black people. And minstrel shows were an American export that were first brought to Europe in about 1836, which actually post-dates this painting. So this painting suggests the origin of the blackface might be earlier than the minstrel shows. Incidentally, the various Morris societies in the UK have now agreed to stop using full black face, and faces are now painted in other colours, green, blue, or sometimes yellow stripes. And a final point on the artist Haydn. He was well known. Benjamin Haydn knew all the great artists and writers of the age, but he lived hand to mouth for years. The reason is he painted large history paintings, noble paintings, which he painted in order to educate the public, but no one would buy them. And this resulted in debts of £3,000. And rather than go to debtor's prison again, he'd been earlier, And because his sight and mind were deteriorating, he decided to commit suicide. He bought a gun, he wrote a will, but even this failed. He shot himself in the head, but the ball failed to penetrate his brain. It bounced off his skull. So with characteristic determination, he slit his throat and killed himself. And in his diary, the last entry reads, "Stretch me no longer on this rough world." A quote from Shakespeare's Lear. This painting, the seamstress or seamstress, represents an important turning point in the Victorians' view of the poor. In 1843, the magazine Punch published a Christmas album, and in it there was a poem by Thomas Hood called The Song of the Shirt. And it's impossible today to understand the enormous impact this poem had. Thackeray described it as the most startling lyric in our language. It was set to music, it was the subject of a play, there were many sermons that quoted it. Articles appeared saying British citizens were being subjected to a form of slavery, and a German living in England at the time, Friedrich Engels, wrote to his friend Karl Marx, who was living in Paris at the time, about the horror of the situation of the poor in England. So this painting by Richard Redgrave is a reaction to the poem, and it was accompanied in the catalogue, the exhibition catalogue, by these lines. "O men with sisters dear, O men with mothers and wives, it's not the linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives." Now, up to then, most painting avoided showing the reality of poverty, but this painting was a turning point in the whole tradition of Victorian social realist painting. It introduced the idea of the deserving poor, like this woman here. Let's look at the painting. You can see it's about 2:30 in the morning. The lit windows opposite indicate the same thing is happening all over London. Her eyes are swollen and inflamed, as she must do close work by the light of a candle. Seamstresses often went blind, and if a single stitch was faulty, their wages were docked. There's a morsel of food on the plate, indicating she has to eat while she's working. And on the mantelpiece, you can see a medicine bottle, indicating that her eyes are being treated. This was terrible, of course, but it wasn't exactly what moved society. The point that struck home is that they woke up to the fact that the poor, remember the poem I read, could be their own sisters, mothers and wives, because in Victorian society, the man was nearly always the sole breadwinner, and there were few morally acceptable jobs for women. So if the husband, the sole breadwinner, died, the dependents could literally be thrown on the streets the following day and could go from being wealthy to being poor, destitute overnight. And so this distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor started to become established. The deserving poor were those like this woman who, through no fault of their own, were unable to afford to house, clothe and feed themselves and sometimes their family. The other type of woman, the undeserving, was the fallen woman, which was a big issue for Victorians. The hypocrisy was enormous. London, it's estimated, had between 8,000 and 80,000 prostitutes, depending on how you define the term. But it was never spoken about in polite society. It was obviously something that was widely used by men, but never mentioned, except between men. This woman is looking up to heaven for support as she tries to make a morally acceptable living and avoid becoming a fallen woman, even if it means she goes blind and eventually dies. So she would be seen by the Victorians as one of the deserving poor, and charities were set up to help them. So we come to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. In 1848, three young artists, the slim, blonde, child prodigy John Everett Millais, the red-haired intellectual womanizer Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and the dark-haired muscular boxer William Holman Hunt, together with four colleagues, formed the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and they rejected the art of the Royal Academy and sought inspiration from earlier masters, artists before Raphael, the pre-Raphaelites. That is before about 1500. Now, this was painted the following year and became one of their most controversial works. You might wonder why. Well, look at it closely. It shows the Holy Family at work in a carpenter's shop. Jesus has just cut his hand on a nail. You can see sticking out from what looks like a door. The blood has dripped onto his foot, foreshadowing the crucifixion. He's comforted by the Virgin Mary in blue, while Joseph holds his hand. Saint Anne, Mary's mother, looks on. A young boy identified as John the Baptist brings a bowl of water to wash the wound, harking back to or harking forward, in fact, in this case, to the baptism. An assistant represents the future apostles, and the flock, the rest of us, are the sheep outside. And there are various other symbols, the ladder representing Jacob's ladder, the dove representing the Holy Spirit. It was revolutionary, but it's not clear that Millais intended to shock, but the public were appalled. Charles Dickens wrote, in household words, the following: "Wherever it's possible to express ugliness of feature, limb or attitude, you have it expressed here. Such men as the carpenter might be undressed in any hospital where dirty drunkards in a high state of varicose veins are received. Their very toes have walked out of St. Giles." End quote. Just by way of explanation, St. Giles was one of the worst slums in London, known for its crime and with the worst living conditions, it's said, in all of London's history. Now, the reason Dickens wrote that is that he described Mary as hideous, horrible in her ugliness, and Christ as wry-necked and blubbering, and the whole painting mean, odious, repulsive and revolting. It was extremely unusual for a critic to describe fine art in this way, because they knew that they could destroy an artist's reputation, because artists depended on good reviews. And artists, of course, had a living to make. The reason for all of this anger was made clear in the art journal at the time, which wrote, "The most beautiful soul must have the most beautiful body." That really says it all. The reason everybody was so horrified is that this is the Holy Family, and they expected them to be represented as idealized, perfect people, perhaps with halos. At this time, society wouldn't accept a carpenter shown as what a carpenter looks like. In fact, Millais went and did sketches of carpenters in carpenters' shops to make sure it was accurate. So it was blasphemous, but no one would have used the term blasphemy at the time, as it was a serious crime, so they wouldn't actually accuse Millais of committing such a serious crime. And it was, I think the latest person to be imprisoned for blasphemy was 1921. By the way, don't worry about whether this painting destroyed Millet's career. It didn't. He was made an associate academician 3 years later. He became part of the art establishment and eventually became president of the Royal Academy. So it did him no harm at all, probably because everybody knew he was a child prodigy, one of the most skilled painters of the time, hard-working and sociable. Here's another painting by Millet. I thought I'd show you two by Turner and two by Millet. This is Ophelia, one of the paintings that visitors to Tate Britain always ask which room it's in. So one of the most sought after, I guess, because it's in all the guidebooks. It's one of the most popular paintings in Tate Britain now. But the Times at the time, the critic in the Times wrote, "There must be something strangely perverse in an imagination which souses Ophelia in a weedy ditch and robs the drowning struggle of that love-lorn maiden of all pathos and beauty." In other words, they didn't like the realism and the lack of idealisation. It was a very common subject, Ophelia, but most artists painted her standing, idealised, looking beautiful beside the river, not floating in the river. The painting itself, by the way, was an enormous physical effort. Unbelievable. It was painted on the banks of what's called the Hogsmill River, which is, in fact, a few miles from where I live. Now, Millet was a very fast painter, yet he said he could only paint an area of this painting no larger than a 5-shilling piece each day. He painted for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, over a 5-month period in 1851, and he told a friend that it was a greater punishment than hanging. He was bitten by flies all day. In November it started to snow. He had to build a hut by the river to finish it. He was chased by the farmer. He was bitten by swans, and he was attacked by wasps and flies. And he didn't finish it there. He left the painting of Ophelia until he reached his studio in London. The model he used was Elizabeth Siddal, who later married Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And Millet painted her in a bath which he heated with candles. But it's said that one day the candles went out and Millet didn't notice she was freezing cold, and she didn't say anything because she didn't want to move, because she was a good model. But she afterwards developed a severe cold, and her father sent Millet a letter demanding £50 for medical expenses. The reason I laughed then was £50 was about twice the annual salary of a live-in servant. It's understood that, I don't know what they settled on, but it's understood that Millet did pay him something, but it was a much lower sum. So Millet was promoting a new way of looking at the world in precise scientific detail. He was motivated by the innocent observations of the artists who worked before Raphael, and he was supported by the leading Victorian art critic, John Ruskin, who described the principal role of the artist as truth to nature. You can tell how much they disliked, the Pre-Raphaelites disliked the old masters. They described the former president of the Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, as Sir Sloshua, because they thought that the old masters were simply sloshing on the paint. And the Pre-Raphaelites wanted to work directly from nature and to copy what they saw in extreme detail. You might also say that they were influenced by the photographic detail of the latest scientific invention of photography. This is an interesting painting by William Dyce. It's called Pegwell Bay, Kent, a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. I'll explain why October the 5th in a moment. But one interpretation of the painting is that it's about time and therefore invokes feelings of the sublime, concerned with the vast age of the earth. Many critics at the time, though, didn't like it. They thought it was travesty because of its microscopic detail. They thought that this detail, which of course was the way that the Pre-Raphaelites painted in their early works, was preventing an overall unified view. It also shows, notice they're collecting shells and stones. It illustrates the middle class interest in geology, and Charles Lyell had published his Principles of Geology in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833, and the entire scientific community was interested, and it became, the Principles of Geology became a sort of dinner party discussion book. It was a controversial attempt to reconcile the implications of geological time with biological scripture. And in that sense, it failed because it didn't reconcile, but it proved that geological time was vastly longer than the times represented in the Bible. We can see other representations of time. There's the setting sun. We can almost feel an autumnal chill in the air, a reminder of death. Now, Dyce painted this on a trip he made in the autumn of 1858 to Pegwell Bay, which is near Ramsgate, which is on the east coast of Kent. And he's painted, it's a portrait of his wife, her 2 sisters and his son. And the interest in geology is shown by his careful recording of the flint-encrusted strata behind and the eroded faces of the chalk cliff. Now, coming to the date, October the 5th, 1858, if you look in the sky, in the centre of the painting, you can just see a faint visible trail. This is Donati's comet, which was at its brightest in the autumn of 1858. It was, the brightest comet to appear during the 19th century. It won't reappear, incidentally, for about 2,000 years. The unstable cliffs were, and still are, the unstable cliffs all along the south coast of England, full of fossils. In fact, in Lyme Regis, which is further along the coast, the famous fossil hunter Mary Anning made some very early discoveries. She found the first plesiosaur skeleton. But, as I said, the critics weren't completely overwhelmed. The Illustrated London News wrote, "A very curiosity of minute handiwork, being painted in the finest of fairy-like lines, with a completeness and exactness which render every microscopic detail palpable to the naked eye." And they added, "A rapid descent from the sublime to the droll." Dyce was a well-known painter. The comments made about this particular painting didn't really affect his reputation. He was superintendent of the Government School of Design. He won a competition of fresco paintings for the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament, and he was also interested in scientific pursuits. He wrote a prize-winning essay on electromagnetism. But he was also a devout high Anglican, and I think this painting probably reflects his feelings of wonder in the scene. And the individual consciousness is sort of subsumed by a sense of the eternal, represented by the comet and the cliffs, and our searching for fossils in a sort of scientific manner. A very different painting to do with the and illustrating the problems of being a woman artist in the Victorian period. And it is by a woman artist, Emily Mary Osborne. It's called Nameless and Friendless. And we can see it's a wet, dismal day outside, and the woman has come into an art dealer's shop to see if she can sell her work. Remember what I said earlier about if the father dies, the women of the household have very few ways of earning money. And many wealthier women were trained in painting as a sort of pastime, not as a professional pursuit. And we can see here from her mourning clothes that her parent or parents have died, so she must earn money to look after herself and what I guess is her brother alongside her. She's nervously pulling on a piece of string as the art dealer disdainfully, look at his face, judges her work. But of course, look at the young assistant up the ladder. He's not looking at her, he's looking at the paintings. And to me, his expression looks as though he's impressed. So maybe the art dealer is just putting on that expression to get a better price. Meanwhile, two so-called swells by the door are sizing her up while ogling a print of a ballet dancer whose bare legs suggests they might have other things on their minds rather than help a desperate young lady. Emily Mary Osborne, she was one of the most important artists associated with the campaign for women's rights in the 19th century, and she was a very successful artist. She began showing her work at the Royal Academy when she was 23, and when she was 27 sold a portrait for 200 guineas and another work to the Queen. And she continued to exhibit virtually every year for the next 40 years. But despite this, and despite her success and her popular renown, she was never made an academician because the way they read the rules of the Royal Academy Constitution, where it said he and man, they interpreted that rather than as a general comment about people. Remember that two of the early founders of the Royal Academy were women. It was interpreted later that it didn't include women, and so women were banned. And women artists were at an enormous disadvantage. And to help them, Osborne founded the Society of Female Artists. One disadvantage, for example, is there were no life drawing classes for women, so they couldn't learn to paint the most lucrative pictures, portraits involving people, and history paintings involving people. As one journal put it in a review of women artists, we have no school for the instruction of ladies in painting from the living model. Labouring under such disadvantages as the female student does, we are not disappointed to see here so many drawings of flowers, fruit and still life objects. In other words, it was accepted that women could never attend life drawing classes. It was thought inappropriate, not just for prudish reasons, but, as another journal put it, because the strength of will and power of creation belong rather to the other sex, that is, they meant men, who we do not, of course, look to the women for more daring efforts. I'll move on at that point to another aspect of Victorian society represented here in a triptych by Augustus Egg. You can see the way they're numbered. One, I'll start with one in the centre. It's a man who's just discovered his wife's infidelity, and the triptych explains the consequences. In number one, misfortune, you can see the wife lying prostrate at her husband's feet. He sits grimly at the table. Their children play cards in the background. In fact, it's a bit hard to see, but they've built a tower of cards which has just fallen down. The husband is holding a letter which contains evidence of his wife's adultery. He's simultaneously crushing a miniature of her lover under his foot, and the room is full of many other details. I talk in much more detail about this in one of my other talks. But let me just point out one thing that you might notice on the table. It's a bit hard to see, but that red thing on the red tablecloth is an apple, and the apple is cut in half, and right to the heart of the apple is cut through with a knife, and then the other half is fallen onto the floor, and you can see the core of the apple. The heart of the apple is rotten. So the rotten, the apple cut in two represents their severed relationship, and the rotten core represents her adultery. But moving on, the other two, look at the moon and the cloud underneath it. The number 2, prayer, and number 3, despair, are at the same time, and they represent what's happened 5 years later. On the right, the 2 daughters are now older, and you can see that they have the 2 portraits of their parents in the room. The 2 parents have died, and we're told that the husband has died of a broken heart. Representing the fact that the social pressure of adultery was so great that the couple had to separate, even though it might kill them both. And on the left, despair, we see the woman. She's holding a child, perhaps the outcome of her affair with her lover. Posters on the wall ironically advertised 2 contemporary plays, Victims by Tom Taylor and The Cure for Love by Tom Parry. They're both about unhappy marriages. And there's also a poster, Pleasure Excursions to Paris, perhaps a reference to novels by Balzac, which, although you can't see it in the centre painting, the books on which the children's house of cards are built includes one by Balzac, and it was thought at the time that these French novels corrupted women, these French novels about unhappy marriages, adultery and affairs. And the woman is in the gutter looking up at the moon and stars, and she's under the arches where many women committed suicide. And here you can just about make out the play Victims, and to the right, Excursions to Paris, ironic reference. A slightly more cheerful painting. And I've selected this to show the type of art that was the most popular with the majority of Victorians. This is Derby Day by William Powell Frith. And it's been described as arguably the definitive example of Victorian modern life genre painting. The whole world is here, the whole world of Victorian society. It's a cross-section of Victorian society, from the swells on the left coming out of the Reform Club tent. Outside the tent there is a thimble rigger who's trying to get you to guess where the P is under 3 cups, and he's busy cheating them. There's a young country gentleman in a smock being held back by his wife to prevent him from gambling, from joining in and betting. There's a man to the right, his left, showing a £5 note that he claims he just won, but of course he hasn't. He's part of the same con. And then another younger man to the right of the thimble rigger is just lost all of his money by betting. Over on the right, there's a man leaning against a carriage, looking at a young flower seller while his mistress sits in the carriage. Spectators throng around. In the centre, there's an acrobat waiting for a young boy to jump into his arms and be thrown in the air. But the young boy is distracted by the feast being laid out in front of him. It's a large painting, a 6-footer, commissioned by J.M.W. for £1,500, a high price for a painting. Frith painted a smaller version, which you might have seen in the Manchester Art Gallery. This one is in the Tate. And Frith hired models for the major figures. He hired a jockey, an acrobat, but he also paid a photographer to take, quote, as many queer groups of figures as he could from the roof of a cab. He set up his camera on top and went round the Epsom Derby taking photographs of groups of people. And some of the female models, look at the woman on the far left. Her back is turned to us and we see her face in profile. She's Annie Gilbert, a very well-known personality, and she modelled directly for Frith because J.M.W. knew her and he introduced her to Frith. The painting was extreme. Well, in fact, it was so popular that they had to put a rail round the painting to protect it from the thronging crowds. It was only the second time that a rail was installed at the Royal Academy. The first was many years before, in 1822. David Wilkes, the Chelsea pensioners, reading the Waterloo Dispatch. And the painting was, to some extent, although it was popular, it was controversial in the sense that some critics didn't like it. It was criticised because it was regarded as artistically philistine. It was criticised by John Ruskin, the art critic, by Oscar Wilde, and believe it or not, by James McNeill Whistler. And this is Whistler. Nocturne, blue and gold, Old Battersea Bridge. This was so controversial. In fact, it gave rise to the central artistic controversy of the whole Victorian period, known as the Whistler versus Ruskin trial. And the trial tells us a lot about how the Victorians regarded art and the nature of the changes Whistler helped bring about. The controversy was about the question, what is art and what is truth in art? It was exhibited in the Grosvenor Gallery in 1877, the year the gallery opened, and it was criticised by John Ruskin in print. He wrote, amongst other criticisms, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." Whistler responded by suing Ruskin for libel. And in essence, the trial revolved around whether a painting should demonstrate skill by accurately representing objects in the world. So when Whistler was asked, are those figures on top of the bridge intended for people? Whistler replied, they are just what you like. And when the judge asked if it was a barge beneath the bridge, Whistler replied, yes, I am very much flattered at you seeing that. The picture is simply a representation of moonlight. My whole scheme was only to bring about a certain harmony of colour. End quote. So the point that Whistler was making is that he was creating a harmonious arrangement of colour, mostly blue with a few gold flecks representing fireworks, I think, in the night sky, rather than he wasn't trying to represent a barge or a bridge in particular. He was using those features of the world as part of a composition that was a harmonious collection of colours. So the way that he created these pictures is he would produce what he called his source, which was basically a thin a thin blue collection of pigment. And he might start on an easel, but he often had to throw the canvas on the floor to stop the source running off. And he left them outside to dry. And he chose those, he threw many away. So when he said in the trial that it took him 2 days to produce, that's not really accurate in a way, because it actually took him months, because most of the work that he produced he threw away. So out of the many works he produced, he just selected a few. The case was actually won by Whistler, but he was awarded damages of a farthing, which was 1/4 of 1 penny, and he had to pay his legal fees, which bankrupted him, and that forced him to sell all of his possessions, including the house he just had built. And he did recover. He went to Venice for a period, and on his return, the etchings and drawings he'd made in Venice were exhibited and were a big success. This is Carnation Lily Lily Rose by John Singer Sargent. You might wonder on the title, it actually was a line from a popular song at the time, so it would have been well known to the people seeing this. And it was his first major success in England. Sargent had just moved from Paris. He was living in a house in the Cotswolds to the west of London, and decided to paint his friend's daughters in the garden. So what we see on the left is the 11-year-old Dolly, and on the right, 7-year-old Polly. And it's a masterly recreation of the subtle evening glow just before sunset. If you look closely, you can see it consists of quick, seemingly effortless brushstrokes, but these were the result of a lot of hard work. To capture the right light, he painted outdoors, but only between August and early November, and so he had to do it over a 2-year period. And for a very short time, between about 6:30 and 7 in the evening, when the light was just right. And if he didn't get it, he would paint an area, and if it wasn't correct, he would scrape off the paint and paint it again the following day, because he wanted to catch that the authenticity of the spontaneous creation of the when putting the paint on the canvas. Incidentally, the flowers died in the summer, so he had to replace them with artificial flowers. And he also changed the shape of the canvas. He cut about 60 centimetres, 2 feet from the left-hand side. He described it later as a fearfully difficult subject. Paints are not bright enough, and then the effect of the light only lasts 10 minutes. This scraping off the paint and repainting is a technique that's called alla prima in Italian, for first attempt, sometimes called au premier coup as the first touch in French. And he took it to an extreme level. It's rarely been done in such a large painting before or since. And we know from examining the painting scientifically, that he even painted wet paint directly on top of wet paint, for example, on the faces, something few artists would ever attempt. It's also an unusual perspective. You don't really notice it, but we're actually looking down on the girls, but we're also at their eye level, looking directly at them. He's combined the two different views. When it was exhibited in 1887, it did cause controversy. Sargent was combining elements of pre-Raphaelite painting and a popular fashion for aestheticism and beauty with French Impressionism. And many critics who knew he knew he was American and had come from France, thought it too French. They described it as too Frenchified. And one comment was it was painted by some, quotes, clever foreigner. And many critics at the time thought Impressionism was, quote, a mistaken idea, shallow, pretentious and untrue. And this is one of the most popular paintings in Tate Britain today. But one critic at the time wrote, could we fancy anyone 100 years hence caring to possess such a picture as this? Many leading artists realised the quality of the painting, and it was actually bought by the Chantry Bequest at the time, which was administered by the Royal Academy, and later it's permanently placed in the Tate. Which brings me to my last painting, The Doctor by Luke Fildes. We see a sick child tended by a doctor. The distraught parents are in the background. Fildes has chosen a rustic interior. The boy's father is resting his hand on the shoulder of his wife, whose hands are clasped in prayer. The man is bravely looking at the doctor, trying to read any signs from the doctor that his son is recovering. They are very poor. There's a scrap of carpet on the floor. The child's makeshift bed consists of two mismatching chairs pushed together. The parents' clothes are ragged, but the child has been given medicine. There's a bowl and a jug of water used to try and reduce his temperature. The scraps of paper on the floor could be prescriptions made out by the doctor. Of course, today there'd be antibiotics, but then there wasn't any antibiotics, so the only hope was the natural immunity of the child. It was in 1890 that Henry Tate commissioned this painting from Fildes for the then vast sum of £3,000, and more unusually, he left the subject to the artist's discretion, and Fildes chose to recall a personal tragedy when his first son in 1877 died at the age of 1. His biographer wrote, the character and bearing of their doctor throughout the time of their anxiety made a deep impression on my parents. The biographer, incidentally, was the Fildes' son. Dr. Murray became a symbol of professional devotion, which would one day inspire the painting of the doctor. End quote. To make it convincing, Fildes actually constructed a cottage interior in his studio, and he left the window of this constructed cottage alongside a window of his studio which let in the early morning light, the dawn light, and he would get up at dawn each day to catch the exact lighting conditions. And dawn was very important. It was regarded by the Victorians, if a child with a fever could survive through the night, then they would live. So, unlike his son, what we see here is a painting with an optimistic note. The child will live because you can see the dawn light coming through the window into the cottage stroke studio. Incidentally, a final there's many other things to say about this painting. In fact, all the paintings that I've shown you. But an interesting point, in 1949, the American Medical Association displayed 65,000 posters of this work as part of their campaign to prevent a national health service being set up by President Truman in America. Their argument was that matters of health were best left to kindly looking physicians like this one rather than to bureaucrats. That was their argument. That's brought me to the end. Slightly longer talk than normal, but I had a lot to cover, and in fact there's even more detail in my notes and more detail in the individual talks I give about the various artists and periods that I've touched on here, like the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to giving you my next talk in the series. Goodbye for now.